Hello, dear listeners, and welcome to the English Globe. I hope you're all doing well and ready for another interesting and educational discussion. Today, we're going to explore a topic that has shaped modern trade, influenced global politics, and affected prices for people all around the world. The title of today's episode is Who Wins the US-China Tariff Battle, and Who Pays the Price? This is one of the most important questions in today's international economy, and by the end of this episode, you'll understand not only what tariffs are, but also how they impact businesses, governments, and everyday people in both the United States and China, and even beyond.
Yes. Welcome everyone to the English Globe. We're so happy to have you here with us. Before we begin, we'd like to kindly remind you to like this video, subscribe to our YouTube channel, and tell us in the comments where you're listening from. We love hearing from you, whether you're learning English in Asia, Africa, Europe, or anywhere in the world. Also, share your opinions about today's topic. Do you think tariffs help a country's economy, or do they create more problems than they solve? Your thoughts make this community more exciting and educational for everyone.
That's right, Julia. So let's start with a simple question. What exactly is a tariff? A tariff is a tax that one country places on goods imported from another country. For example, if the United States decides to put a tariff on Chinese steel, it means that American companies importing steel from China have to pay an extra tax to the U.S. government. The main goal of this is usually to make imported goods more expensive, so that local products become more competitive. Tariffs have been used for hundreds of years as tools of economic policy, sometimes to protect domestic industries, sometimes to raise government revenue, and sometimes, as in the case of the US and China, as a weapon in trade disputes.
Exactly, Adam. The idea behind tariffs might sound simple, but their effects can be quite complex. When a country puts tariffs on foreign products, it's trying to protect its own workers and industries from outside competition. For example, if Chinese companies produce goods more cheaply than American ones, US leaders might use tariffs to give local factories a better chance to survive. However, this protection also means that American consumers may end up paying more for the same products because imported goods become more expensive and domestic producers don't have to lower prices as much. So, while tariffs can help one group, they can also hurt another. And that's why this issue is so controversial.
That's a great point, Julia. And this is exactly what makes the US-China tariff situation so fascinating, and so important for all of us to understand. The United States and China are the two largest economies in the world. The products they trade, from electronics and cars to clothing and food, affect almost every country in some way. When these two nations raise tariffs on each other's goods, the effects don't stay between them. Prices, production, and even jobs in other countries can change as a result. So, what started as a trade disagreement between two nations has become a global economic story that touches millions of people.
Right. And what's interesting for our English learners to notice is how economic terms like tariff, trade deficit, and import tax are not just words from textbooks. They describe real-life issues that affect families, businesses, and governments. When you read international news or listen to global podcasts, you'll often hear these words. Understanding them helps you not only improve your English, but also become more informed about how the world economy works. And that's exactly what we want to do together today, to help you learn English through real global topics that matter.
Yes, because English learning is not only about grammar or vocabulary, it's also about understanding how to communicate ideas about the real world. And this topic, the tariff battle, gives us a perfect opportunity to do that. Over the past few years, the US and China have been placing tariffs on each other's goods. The United States has argued that China's trade practices are unfair and harm American industries. China, on the other hand, has said that the U.S. is trying to limit its rise as a global economic power. These opposing views have led to what many experts call a trade war, even though no weapons are involved, only taxes negotiations, and political pressure.
And while the term trade war might sound dramatic, the reality is that it affects real people in very practical ways. When tariffs increase, companies often have to raise prices. That means consumers, ordinary people like you and me, might pay more for phones, clothes, or even food. At the same time, some local factories might benefit because imported goods become more expensive, giving them a chance to sell more of their own products. So the question who wins is not easy to answer, because every decision creates both winners and losers in different parts of society.
That's why today's discussion is so valuable, especially for English learners who want to understand not only language, but also the logic behind global events. When you learn about trade, tariffs, and economic competition, you also learn how countries make decisions that shape our shared future. You begin to see how connected our world is, how a decision made in Washington or Beijing can influence prices in London, Nairobi, or New Delhi. In other words, understanding trade helps us understand globalization, and globalization is one of the most important forces of the 21st century.
So in this episode, Adam and I will guide you step by step through this complex issue. We'll explore where the trade tensions between the US and China came from, what triggered the tariff war, who has been affected the most, and what the future might look like. But before we dive into the historical background, we want to encourage you once again. Please hit that like button, subscribe to the English Globe, and share your thoughts in the comments. Tell us, do you think tariffs are good for protecting local industries, or do they create more problems by increasing prices for consumers? Your opinion matters, and we'd love to include your ideas in our next discussion.
That's a perfect way to start, Julia. So, dear listeners, get ready for a deep yet simple explanation of one of the world's biggest economic rivalries. Remember, as you listen, try to notice the vocabulary we use. Words like tariffs, trade balance, exports, imports, and economic policy. These are key terms you'll often hear in English news and business conversations. Understanding them will make you more confident and fluent in discussing international topics. Now, let's begin by looking back in history and exploring how the trade tensions between these two powerful nations actually began.
To truly understand the tariff battle between the United States and China, we first need to travel back in time and look at how trade relations between these two countries developed over the past few decades. The connection between America and China has always been complex, part partnership, part competition, and this relationship has changed dramatically since China began to open its economy to the world in the late 1970s. Back then, China was still a developing nation, but under the leadership of Deng Xiaoping, it started to adopt market-oriented reforms that encouraged investment, trade, and modernization.
Yes, Julia, and those reforms completely transformed China's economy. In just a few decades, China moved from being largely agricultural and poor to becoming one of the biggest industrial powers in history. Factories were built, millions of workers entered the global market, and foreign companies, including many from the United States, began to invest heavily in China because of its low production costs and skilled labor. American businesses saw a huge opportunity. They could manufacture products in China for much less money and then sell them at home and abroad for higher profits. This was the beginning of what economists often call the Made in China era.
Exactly, Adam. By the early 2000s, China had become known as the world's factory, producing everything from electronics and clothing to furniture and toys. In 2001, China joined the World Trade Organization, which officially integrated it into the global trade system. This was a turning point. It meant that China could trade more freely with other countries, and its exports to the United States began to rise very quickly. For American consumers, this was good news because they could buy many products at lower prices. But for American workers, especially in manufacturing industries, it became a challenge because many factories began closing down as production moved overseas.
That's an important point. The growth of Chinese exports created what economists call a trade imbalance, or trade deficit. This means that the United States was importing far more from China than it was exporting to China. To give a simple example, if America bought $500 billion worth of goods from China, but only sold $100 billion worth of products to China, the result would be a trade deficit of $400 billion. Some American leaders began to see this as a sign that China was taking advantage of the global trading system, that it was exporting too much and importing too little. This perception became one of the root causes of later tensions.
Yes, and at the same time, China was also growing stronger in technology, infrastructure, and global influence. It was no longer just a country that made cheap products. It was developing its own advanced industries, from telecommunications and electronics to renewable energy. For many in the United States, this rapid progress created a sense of competition and even concern. Some American companies felt that Chinese firms were benefiting from government support, giving them an unfair advantage in global markets. These issues slowly built up pressure over time until they finally exploded into open trade conflict years later.
And that explosion happened around 2018, when the United States government decided to take a tougher stance on China's trade practices. Washington accused Beijing of unfair trade behavior, including intellectual property theft, forced technology transfers, and subsidies for Chinese companies, which made it difficult for American firms to compete fairly. In response, the U.S. government announced tariffs on hundreds of billions of dollars worth of Chinese goods. This was the beginning of the tariff battle that we're talking about today, a conflict that would soon affect the global economy.
China didn't stay silent either. It quickly responded by placing its own tariffs on American goods, especially on products like soybeans, cars, and other exports that were important to U.S. farmers and manufacturers. This created what economists call a tit-for-tat situation, meaning that every time one side raised tariffs, the other side responded in the same way. Within months, the world's two largest economies were locked in a trade war that caused uncertainty in global markets, affected stock prices, and made international companies nervous about the future.
That's right. And this back and forth continued for years. While both governments claimed they were trying to protect their national interests, the reality was that both economies were suffering side effects. Businesses that depended on imported materials faced higher costs. Consumers had to pay more for everyday items. And investors around the world began to worry that the trade war could slow down global economic growth. For many analysts, it was a reminder that when two economic giants fight, the entire world can feel the shock.
And what's really fascinating, Adam, is that while the trade tensions made headlines, the deeper issue was not only about tariffs, it was also about who would lead the global economy in the 21st century. The United States had been the dominant economic power since the end of World War II, but China's rise challenged that position. This competition wasn't just about trade, it was also about technology, innovation, and global influence. The trade war became a symbol of that larger struggle for economic leadership, which is why it continues to attract attention from economists and policymakers around the world.
Exactly. And this is where we can see how economics, politics, and technology all connect. When countries trade, they don't just exchange goods, they also exchange power, ideas, and influence. For English learners, it's helpful to understand this relationship through real examples like the US-China case. The words we learn, tariffs, exports, trade deficit, negotiations, economic policy, are not just vocabulary items. They represent the tools and strategies that countries use to shape their future. Understanding them helps us see the world in a more informed and intelligent way.
That's so true. So when we look at the history of US-China trade relations, we're not just studying numbers or policies. We're exploring how two very different systems, one based on Western capitalism and another shaped by state-led development, have learned to compete and cooperate in the same global marketplace. Over time, that relationship has gone through ups and downs, periods of trust, and times of conflict. The tariff battle is simply the latest chapter in a much longer story of competition and interdependence.
And as we move forward in this discussion, we'll take a closer look at how this trade war actually began, what specific events triggered the tariffs, what products were targeted, and how both sides reacted. But before we move on, it's important to remember one key idea. The US-China relationship is not just about rivalry, it's also about connection. Even during trade conflicts, the two countries continue to rely on each other in countless ways, from manufacturing and technology to finance and education. Their economies are deeply linked, which means that their policies, no matter how competitive, always have global consequences.
That's a great way to put it, Adam. And for our listeners, this is an opportunity to expand your English vocabulary while also deepening your understanding of international relations. When you hear news about tariffs or trade agreements, you'll now know that behind every headline, there's a long history of negotiation, growth, and sometimes disagreement. In the next part, we'll explore the trigger point, how a series of economic and political decisions led to the start of the US-China tariff war, and how it began to reshape global trade as we know it.
Now that we've talked about the history of US-China trade relations, let's move to the moment when the situation changed from simple disagreement to something much more serious, the start of the tariff war. To understand what triggered it, we have to look at a combination of economic, political, and strategic factors that came together at the same time. The roots of the conflict go beyond just trade numbers. They include concerns about technology, national security, and the future balance of power in the global economy.
That's true, Adam. The official beginning of the tariff war is often linked to early 2018, when the United States government announced that it would impose tariffs on a wide range of Chinese goods. The US administration at that time argued that China had been engaging in unfair trade practices for many years. These included things like giving massive support to Chinese companies through government subsidies, making it difficult for foreign companies to compete, and requiring some American businesses to share their technology with Chinese partners when they wanted to operate inside China.
Yes, and from Washington's point of view, this situation had gone on for too long. American leaders said that China's economic model, one that combined state planning with market competition, gave Chinese companies an advantage that US firms didn't have. They also raised concerns about what they called intellectual property theft, meaning that ideas, patents, or inventions created by American companies were being copied or used by others without permission. These issues had been discussed for years in diplomatic meetings, but 2018 was the year when the United States decided to take direct action.
Exactly, and that direct action came in the form of tariffs, taxes on goods imported from China. The first wave targeted products worth about $50 billion, focusing on industrial and technological goods like machinery, electronics, and vehicle parts. The message was clear. The United States wanted to pressure China to change its trade practices and to negotiate new rules that it believed would be more balanced and fair. However, China immediately responded by announcing its own tariffs on American exports, especially on agricultural goods like soybeans and corn, which are vital to US farmers.
That response surprised many people, because it showed that China wasn't going to stay quiet or accept the tariffs without action. Instead, Beijing decided to match Washington's moves, step by step. Economists call this kind of reaction retaliation, which means answering one country's trade action with a similar one of your own. So, each time the United States raised tariffs, China did the same. Within months, both sides had increased tariffs on hundreds of billions of dollars worth of goods. It quickly became clear that this was not just a negotiation tactic. It had become a full-scale trade conflict.
Yes, And it wasn't just about money. The tariff war soon became symbolic of something much bigger, a struggle for economic and technological leadership. Both countries were trying to protect their industries of the future. For example, the United States worried that China's ambitious plan called Made in China 2025, which aimed to make China a global leader in advanced industries like robotics, artificial intelligence, and green energy, would challenge American dominance in these areas. At the same time, China viewed US tariffs as an attempt to slow down its progress and limit its growth.
That's a very important point, Julia. This is why experts often say that the US-China tariff war wasn't only about trade, it was also about power and technology. The modern global economy depends heavily on innovation, data, and digital infrastructure. So, when two superpowers compete over these areas, it affects everything from the cost of smartphones to the development of new energy systems. The tariffs were, in many ways, the surface-level tools of a deeper strategic competition between two nations with very different visions for the future of the world economy.
And of course, the effects of these tariffs didn't stay limited to government policies. They started to affect companies, workers, and consumers almost immediately. American businesses that imported parts from China suddenly had to pay more. This made production more expensive, and in many cases companies passed those extra costs to customers by raising prices. On the other side, Chinese exporters faced difficulties because their goods became more expensive in the US market, leading to a drop in sales. This caused a chain reaction that spread across the global economy.
Right? And that's something we should emphasize for our listeners who are learning English and economics together. A tariff war doesn't just mean governments arguing. It means millions of people feeling the consequences in everyday life. Farmers in the US who sold crops to China saw their exports decrease. Factories in China that produced goods for the American market had to slow down or cut jobs. Even companies in other countries like Japan, South Korea, or Germany were affected because many global supply chains include parts made in both the US and China. When the world's two largest economies fight, everyone feels some impact.
That's very true. Another key trigger behind the tariff war was political timing. In both countries, leaders wanted to show their citizens that they were defending national interests. In the United States, tariffs were presented as a way to bring back jobs and reduce the trade deficit with China. In China, the government framed the situation as a test of national strength and independence, encouraging its people to support local industries. So, beyond economics, there was also a sense of national pride on both sides. This made it even harder for either country to back down, because doing so could look like weakness in front of their people.
Yes, and that political factor kept the tensions alive even when both sides tried to negotiate. There were several rounds of trade talks between Washington and Beijing during this period, and for a while, it looked like a deal might be possible. In January 2020, both governments signed what was called the Phase 1 trade agreement. In that deal, China agreed to buy more American products and strengthen protection for intellectual property rights. The U.S. in return agreed to reduce some tariffs, but not all of them. Many hoped this would calm the situation, but it was really only a temporary pause.
Exactly, because even though the agreement brought a short break in new tariffs, it didn't solve the deeper issues that caused the trade conflict in the first place. Concerns about technology, investment rules, and economic dominance still remained. Then came new global challenges, including the COVID-19 pandemic, which added even more pressure to both economies. As a result, many tariffs stayed in place, and the trade war continued to influence business decisions, supply chains, and global markets long after the first headlines disappeared.
That's right, and the key lesson for our listeners is that a trade war like this shows how interconnected modern economies are. What began as a national policy decision quickly turned into a global issue. It affected how companies produce, how consumers spend, and how countries plan their futures. For English learners, this is a good example of how words like tariff, retaliation, and trade deficit describe not just numbers, but also relationships between nations. Understanding these ideas helps you follow global news and think critically about what's happening in the world.
Absolutely, Adam. And as we've seen, the US-China tariff war was triggered not by one single event, but by a series of long-term tensions, political choices, and technological ambitions. It's a story of two countries trying to protect their interests in a rapidly changing world. In the next part, we'll explore the impact of these decisions on the United States itself, how tariffs changed industries, affected jobs, and influenced prices for American consumers. Because in every trade conflict, it's not just governments that pay the price, it's also the people who live and work within those economies.
When we talk about the US-China tariff battle, it's important to remember that every decision in global trade has real consequences at home. For the United States, the tariffs were meant to protect American industries, especially those that were struggling because of cheaper imports from China. The idea behind tariffs was simple: make foreign goods more expensive so that people buy more American-made products. But in reality, things turned out to be much more complicated. Because when tariffs are imposed on goods coming from China, American companies and consumers often end up paying the higher prices, not the foreign sellers.
Exactly, Adam. Tariffs can sound like a clever tool to protect jobs, but they can also act like a hidden tax on everyday people. When the US government placed tariffs on Chinese imports, from electronics and clothing to machinery and furniture, the cost of those goods increased in American stores. Many companies had no choice but to pass those extra costs on to consumers. That means higher prices for families buying phones, TVs, or even basic household items. It's not always visible to everyone, but this slow and steady rise in prices adds pressure to the average American household budget.
And for many small businesses in the US, that rise in costs became a real challenge. Imagine a small manufacturer in Ohio that depends on Chinese-made components to build its final products. When tariffs hit, the cost of those imported parts jumped. But it wasn't easy for these businesses to switch to new suppliers or start buying locally, because domestic alternatives were often more expensive or unavailable. So, instead of helping small American factories, tariffs sometimes made it harder for them to stay competitive, especially against larger companies that could afford to absorb the higher costs.
That's a good point, Adam. Tariffs also had a noticeable effect on American farmers, a group that found itself in a very difficult position. China is one of the biggest buyers of US agricultural products like soybeans, pork, and corn. When the trade war began, China responded by placing its own tariffs on American goods. That made US farm exports to China much more expensive, and as a result, demand dropped sharply. Many farmers saw their incomes fall, their exports decline, and their crops go unsold. Some even had to rely on government aid to survive through those tough years.
Yes, the agricultural sector really became a symbol of the trade war's unintended consequences. The US government provided billions of dollars in subsidies to help farmers recover, but that money came from taxpayers. So in a sense, the American public was paying twice, first through higher prices on imported goods, and then again through taxes used to support affected industries. It's a clear example of how economic policies that seem to target foreign competitors can end up circling back to affect local economies and households.
Another important impact was on inflation. When tariffs made imported goods more expensive, many industries faced higher production costs. Over time, this contributed to a general increase in prices, what economists call inflationary pressure. It's not that tariffs alone caused inflation, but they certainly added fuel to the fire, especially in sectors like technology, construction, and manufacturing. This made it more difficult for the Federal Reserve, America's central bank, to balance economic growth with stable prices.
And even though the goal was to bring back manufacturing jobs to the United States, the results were mixed. Some companies did open new factories or expanded local production, but others moved their operations to other countries like Vietnam, Mexico, or India, places not affected by the same tariffs. So instead of a full return of jobs to the U.S., we saw a redirection of global supply chains. This shows that the world economy is deeply interconnected, and trade policies can't always force industries to behave in predictable ways.
That interconnection is exactly what makes this issue so complex. American consumers want affordable goods. American workers want stable jobs. And American companies want access to global markets. Tariffs try to balance all three goals, but often one group benefits while another suffers. For example, protecting steel producers might help a few thousand jobs in that industry, but it raises costs for automakers and construction companies that rely on steel. So in the end, tariffs can feel like taking one step forward and one step back.
What's interesting, Julia, is that while some industries suffered, a few actually benefited from the tariff policy. Certain domestic manufacturers that directly competed with Chinese imports saw their sales rise. For example, U.S.-based producers of washing machines and aluminum reported short-term gains because imported alternatives became more expensive. But these benefits were often temporary, and as input costs rose, even those industries started to feel the pressure. It's a reminder that trade battles rarely produce clear winners.
That's true. And one of the biggest lessons here is that tariffs alone can't rebuild an entire economy. The US economy thrives on innovation, technology, education, and productivity. These are the real long-term solutions to making American industries stronger and more competitive globally. Tariffs can create a temporary shield, but they don't replace the need for investment in skills, infrastructure, and research. Without these foundations, protectionist policies can only go so far before they start hurting the same people they were meant to help.
So, when we ask, who pays the price? In this trade war, the answer is not just China or the U.S. government. It's often the ordinary American, the worker who faces job uncertainty, the family that sees prices go up, and the small business that struggles to keep its costs down. The tariff battle may have been launched in the name of fairness and strength, but its impact shows that economic tools like these come with real trade-offs that affect millions of people across the country.
And that's why it's so important for people to understand the economic reality behind political slogans. Tariffs sound like a strong and simple solution, but in practice, they're a complex instrument that touches every layer of the economy. From farmers in rural areas to families in big cities, everyone feels the ripple effects. By studying and discussing these impacts, we can make more informed decisions and have a clearer conversation about what really helps the economy grow in a fair and sustainable way.
Absolutely. Understanding this helps us see that trade isn't just about numbers or policies. It's about people. Every tariff, every policy change, and every trade agreement affects real lives. That's why studying the economic impact on the United States is so essential, especially for learners who want to understand how global issues connect to their daily experiences. The tariff battle between the U.S. and China may have started as a political decision, but its consequences reached into homes, farms, and factories across America, shaping the economic landscape for years to come. Now that we've explored how the tariff battle affected the United States, let's turn our attention to China, the other major player in this economic story. When the U.S. began imposing tariffs on Chinese goods, it wasn't just a small change in trade policy. It was a major shock to the world's second-largest economy. China had built its growth model for decades around exporting goods to the United States and other Western countries. So when those exports suddenly faced heavy taxes, it was like hitting a roadblock for Chinese industries that depended on global markets.
That's right, Adam. The word export means selling goods and services to another country, and for China, exports have been one of the main engines of economic growth. For years, Chinese factories produced everything from electronics and toys to machinery and clothing, and much of that went to American consumers. When tariffs made those goods more expensive in the US market, Chinese exporters had to deal with a sudden drop in demand. Many companies found themselves in a difficult position, with unsold goods, reduced profits, and the risk of losing their biggest trading partner.
Yes, and another key term we should teach our listeners here is supply chain. A supply chain refers to the network of companies and processes involved in producing and delivering a product, from raw materials to final delivery. China had become a global hub for supply chains, meaning that many international companies relied on Chinese factories for parts, components, or final assembly. When tariffs disrupted this system, it didn't just hurt China's exports, it created ripple effects across the world. Companies in Europe, Japan, and even the US that depended on Chinese production suddenly had to rethink where and how they sourced their goods.
Exactly. And that's where the idea of market diversification became important for China. Market diversification means spreading your trade and investments across different markets, so you're not dependent on just one country. After the US tariffs, China started building stronger trade ties with countries in Asia, Africa, and Latin America. For example, Chinese companies increased exports to countries like Vietnam, Indonesia, and India. They also deepened partnerships through organizations like the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, RCEP, a huge trade agreement connecting many Asian economies. This helped reduce China's dependence on the US market and gave it more flexibility in global trade.
That was a smart move. And we should also talk about imports, which are goods that a country buys from abroad. The trade war affected China's imports too, because when the economy slowed, Chinese companies imported fewer goods and materials. But at the same time, the Chinese government encouraged domestic industries to produce more locally, especially in key areas like semiconductors, technology, and renewable energy. This was part of a larger strategy called Made in China 2025, which aims to make China more self-reliant and less dependent on foreign technology.
And this shift brought both challenges and opportunities. On one hand, it was painful for companies that lost access to US markets. Some factories had to lay off workers or close down completely, especially in industries like textiles, electronics, and manufacturing of household goods. But on the other hand, the pressure of tariffs pushed China to invest heavily in innovation. In areas like artificial intelligence, robotics, electric vehicles, and green energy. Instead of only being the world's factory, China began to focus on becoming a global leader in technology and innovation.
That's an excellent observation. And in fact, China's response to the tariffs showed how flexible and adaptive its economy can be. When trade slowed with the United States, China didn't just wait for the situation to improve. It took active steps to strengthen its domestic economy. The government introduced policies to support small businesses, invest in infrastructure, and stimulate local demand. This focus on internal growth helped reduce some of the damage caused by falling exports. It also supported millions of workers by creating new jobs in construction, transportation, and technology sectors.
Another interesting aspect is how consumer behavior changed inside China. With tariffs making some imported products more expensive, many Chinese consumers turned toward local brands. Domestic companies in fashion, electronics, and food started to gain popularity. This rise in local consumption is something economists call import substitution, which means replacing foreign goods with domestic alternatives. It not only helps local businesses grow, but also keeps more money circulating within the national economy, something very useful during times of global trade tension.
Yes, and while these adjustments helped China stay strong, there were still real economic challenges. Export growth slowed, some factories saw fewer international orders, and overall business confidence dropped for a while. But what's impressive is that China managed to maintain steady growth even during the trade war. The government's quick policy actions, including tax cuts, infrastructure investment, and new trade partnerships, softened the blow. And gradually, China's companies learned to adapt to the new trade environment by improving quality, diversifying their markets, and moving up the value chain.
That last phrase, moving up the value chain, is a great one for our English learners to remember. It means producing more advanced, high-quality, and high-value products instead of low-cost goods. For example, instead of making only cheap toys or clothing, a country starts producing electric cars, advanced electronics, or computer chips. That's exactly what China has been trying to do in recent years. The trade war, in some ways, acted as a wake-up call, showing China that it couldn't depend forever on cheap exports and needed to focus more on innovation and technology.
You're absolutely right, Julia. And if we look at the long-term impact, China's strategy seems to have worked fairly well. The country's trade with Southeast Asia, Africa, and Europe has grown, while its domestic technology industries have become stronger. Even though tariffs caused short-term pain, they also accelerated China's transformation from a manufacturing-based economy to a technology-driven one. It's fascinating to see how an external challenge like the tariff war became a turning point in China's economic development.
That's what makes this story so important for our listeners. It's not just about economics, it's also about adaptability and resilience. The way China responded teaches us that every challenge can become an opportunity if managed wisely. And for English learners, understanding terms like exports, imports, supply chain, and market diversification is essential to grasp how the global economy works. These words describe the movement of goods, the connections between countries, and the choices nations make to protect their interests in a complex world.
Exactly, Julia. The US-China tariff battle was not just a political conflict. It was a lesson in how deeply the global economy is interconnected. Both countries faced difficulties, both adapted in different ways, and both changed how they approached trade and technology. In the end, while China faced real challenges from the tariffs, it also used the situation to push forward its long-term goals, building stronger industries, expanding its markets, and becoming more self-reliant. It's a story that shows how economic pressure can sometimes lead to growth, innovation, and transformation. Now that we've looked at how the US and China were directly affected by tariffs, it's time to step back and see the bigger picture. How the rest of the world felt the impact of this economic conflict. The US-China trade war wasn't just a dispute between two major powers. It sent shockwaves throughout the global economy. When two of the largest trading nations in the world start imposing tariffs on each other, the effects ripple outward, touching countries, businesses, and workers everywhere. This is what economists call global interdependence, the idea that all economies are linked together, and when one part of the system changes, everyone else feels the impact in some way.
Exactly, Adam. Global interdependence means that no country stands completely alone in today's economy. Most nations depend on others for imports, exports, investment, or technology. When trade slows between the US and China, it can reduce the flow of goods and money across many borders. For smaller nations, especially those in Asia, Africa, and Latin America, this can be quite serious. Many of them supply raw materials, parts, or labor to Chinese factories that export to the United States. So, when Chinese exports decline, those smaller economies can lose business, jobs, and income. It's like a chain reaction that travels across the world.
That's a really good point, Julia. For example, think about countries like Vietnam, Malaysia, and Thailand. When the trade war began, some global companies started moving their manufacturing out of China to avoid tariffs on Chinese goods. These Southeast Asian countries suddenly became new manufacturing hubs, which helped their economies grow in the short term. But it also brought new challenges. They had to build better infrastructure, train more workers, and deal with pressure from rising demand. So while some countries benefited, Others found themselves struggling to keep up with the fast changes in global trade patterns.
Yes. And we shouldn't forget about countries that depend heavily on exporting commodities like oil, metals, or agricultural products. The tariff conflict slowed global trade growth, and when trade slows, demand for raw materials also decreases. That meant lower prices for countries that rely on exporting those resources, such as Brazil, Australia, and many African nations. Even though these countries were not directly involved in the trade war, they experienced side effects through lower global demand and weaker export revenues. It shows how connected the global economy really is. One major disruption can affect markets thousands of miles away.
And this uncertainty also hit global companies in a big way. Many multinational corporations, companies that operate in several countries, depend on both U.S. and Chinese markets. When tariffs came into play, these companies suddenly had to rethink their entire supply chain. For example, a car company might produce parts in China, assemble them in Mexico, and sell them in the U.S. But if one link in that chain faces higher tariffs, the whole process becomes more expensive and complicated. This is why many global businesses delayed investments, canceled projects, or even relocated their operations to avoid risks.
That's true, Adam. The trade war created a sense of economic uncertainty, a term that means businesses and investors were unsure about the future of trade policies, prices, and global growth. Uncertainty is one of the biggest enemies of economic progress because it makes people cautious. When companies are unsure about future costs, they hold back on expanding or hiring more workers. When investors fear instability, they move their money into safer assets instead of funding new projects. This cautious behavior can slow down the entire world economy.
We also saw changes in foreign direct investment, or FDI, which refers to when a company invests money in another country to build factories or businesses. During the U.S.-China trade war, FDI between the two countries dropped sharply. But interestingly, other nations became new destinations for investment. Countries like Vietnam, Indonesia, India, and Mexico saw an increase in foreign companies setting up factories there. This shift reshaped global production networks and introduced a new wave of economic competition among developing nations trying to attract investors.
Yes, and while that opened opportunities for some, it also placed smaller nations in a difficult position, caught in the middle of two economic giants. Many of them didn't want to choose sides between the US and China. For instance, some Asian countries rely on China for trade, but depend on the US for security or financial aid. This balancing act became more complicated as tensions grew. It's a good example for our listeners of how geopolitics, the link between politics and geography, often influences global trade. A small policy change in Washington or Beijing can create political and economic consequences in dozens of other capitals around the world.
Absolutely, Julia. And another interesting thing that happened was the rise of regional trade agreements. Since global trade between the US and China became more difficult, many countries started signing deals with each other to make trade easier within their regions. For example, the European Union deepened its internal trade ties, while Asian nations formed the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, RCEP, which we mentioned earlier. These agreements were designed to keep goods moving freely, even when larger powers were raising barriers. In a way, the trade war encouraged smaller economies to cooperate more closely with each other.
And while all these shifts were happening, consumers around the world also felt the effects. Tariffs didn't just raise prices in the US, they influenced global pricing patterns. Products that used to be made cheaply in China became more expensive everywhere. Electronics, clothing, and household goods saw higher price tags. Even transportation costs increased because companies had to adjust their routes and logistics to avoid tariffs. This shows how trade policies can influence what people pay in stores across the planet, even if they live far from the conflict itself.
Yes, And it's fascinating how this one trade dispute exposed the world's deep level of economic interconnection. When the US and China clashed, global growth slowed down. International organizations like the International Monetary Fund, IMF, and the World Bank even had to revise their global growth forecasts several times. They warned that the ongoing tariff conflict could reduce overall world economic output by hundreds of billions of dollars. So, even countries not directly involved in the trade war experienced slower growth, weaker exports, and less investment.
And that's a valuable lesson for everyone learning about global economics. We often think of nations as independent actors, but in reality, the global economy is like a living network. Every part depends on the others. The concept of global interdependence reminds us that cooperation and stability are vital. When major countries choose confrontation instead of collaboration, the whole world feels the consequences. It also helps us understand why international trade rules, global institutions, and diplomacy matter so much in maintaining balance and prosperity for all.
Well said, Julia. The US-China tariff battle was more than a dispute over money or market access. It was a test of how connected our world has become. Smaller countries had to adapt. Global businesses faced uncertainty, and ordinary people around the world experienced the effects through rising prices and slower growth. This global chain reaction demonstrates that no economy exists in isolation. The actions of one nation can echo across borders, shaping the future of trade, investment, and economic cooperation for everyone.
Exactly, Adam. And for our listeners here at the English Globe, understanding this topic helps you see how international events are connected to everyday life, from the prices you pay for products to the opportunities created by global trade. It's also a great way to build your vocabulary and critical thinking about world affairs. So, whenever you hear about trade wars, tariffs, or market tensions, remember, these aren't just numbers on a screen. They represent a story that includes all of us, in one way or another, as part of a truly interconnected world.
When people first hear the term trade war, it might sound like something that only affects politicians, big companies, or economists. But the truth is, trade wars often reach deep into the everyday lives of ordinary people. So, when we ask the question, who really pays the price in the US-China tariff battle? The honest answer is almost everyone, in one way or another. The higher costs created by tariffs don't stay in the hands of governments. They slowly travel down the economic chain, from large corporations to small businesses, from importers to consumers, from factory owners to workers. And by the time all these costs spread out, they quietly touch the lives of millions of people around the world.
That's such an important point, Adam. Many people think that tariffs punish foreign countries, but in most cases, the burden ends up falling on the people inside the country that imposes them. For example, when the United States raised tariffs on Chinese imports, it was American importers who had to pay those higher taxes at the border. Importers then passed those costs to retailers, and retailers passed them to consumers. So, prices for many goods, like clothing, electronics, and even toys, increased in American stores. And for families living paycheck to paycheck, even small price increases can have a real impact on their monthly budget.
Exactly. Let's think about a very simple example. Suppose an American company imports parts from China to assemble smartphones in the US. Before tariffs, the company could buy those parts at a low cost. But after tariffs were imposed, the cost of those parts rose by, let's say, 25%. The company then has three choices. It can raise the price of its phones, reduce the number of employees to save costs, or accept smaller profits. None of these options are good for ordinary people. Higher prices hurt consumers, fewer workers mean lost jobs, and lower profits can stop businesses from investing in future growth. In the end, everyone feels the weight.
Yes, and what's interesting is that both American and Chinese consumers experienced similar problems during the trade war. When China responded by placing tariffs on US goods, Chinese buyers also faced higher prices for American products, such as soybeans, pork, and cars. For example, farmers in the US lost access to the Chinese market, but Chinese importers had to pay more to get agricultural goods from other sources. As a result, food prices rose in China, and industries that relied on US materials became more expensive to run. So both sides suffered in different ways. It's a clear demonstration that in trade wars, there are no real winners, only shared losses.
That's absolutely true. Economists often say that a trade war is like a tax on everyone. Governments collect more money from tariffs, but ordinary people are the ones paying for it through higher prices. Let's also remember that global trade isn't just about goods, it's also about jobs. Many industries depend on international trade to stay alive. When tariffs disrupt trade flows, some companies lose customers, and workers lose their jobs. During the height of the US-China trade tensions, several American factories reported layoffs because they couldn't afford the rising costs of imported materials. Meanwhile, Chinese exporters faced factory closures and job cuts as orders from the US dropped sharply.
And it's not just workers in factories who are affected. Think about truck drivers, port workers, and people in the shipping and logistics industry. When global trade slows down, fewer goods move across borders, which means fewer hours of work and less income for those workers. Even small business owners, like shopkeepers or online sellers, face problems because they rely on imported products to keep their shelves full or their online stores running. A trade war might begin in political offices, but it ends up touching the daily lives of people who have nothing to do with international policy.
Right, Julia. And another group that ends up paying the price is small and medium-sized enterprises, often called SMEs. These are smaller businesses that don't have the same financial strength as big corporations to deal with higher costs. When tariffs hit, SMEs can't easily move production to other countries or renegotiate big contracts. Many of them simply absorb the costs or close down. In contrast, large multinational companies can often find ways around tariffs by shifting production or passing costs onto consumers. So, in a strange way, trade wars can hurt the very businesses they are supposed to protect.
Yes, and this brings us to an important word for our English learners: inflation. Inflation means the general increase in prices over time. Tariffs can directly add to inflation because they make imported goods more expensive. When everyday products like food, electronics, and clothing rise in price, the purchasing power of consumers decreases. That means people can buy less with the same amount of money. For middle and lower income families, this effect can be especially painful. So, even if tariffs are meant to strengthen the economy, they can end up making life harder for the average citizen.
That's so well explained, Julia. And we also have to consider the psychological side, something economists call consumer confidence. When people hear news about trade wars, job losses, or rising prices, they often start to feel uncertain about the future. This uncertainty can make consumers spend less and save more. When spending slows down, businesses earn less, which leads to even slower economic growth. It becomes a cycle that feeds itself. Tariffs create fear, fear reduces spending, and reduced spending weakens the economy. So, even before the full effects of tariffs are felt in prices or jobs, the fear of instability can start to affect economic behavior.
That's so true. And another thing to keep in mind is that the effects of tariffs don't stop at national borders. Because the global economy is so interconnected, higher costs in one country can lead to higher prices in another. For instance, if the US imposes tariffs on Chinese steel, American construction companies pay more for materials. That could make new buildings, bridges, and homes more expensive. Then, other countries that buy construction materials or technology from the US may also face price increases. It's like throwing a stone into a pond. The ripples spread far beyond where the stone landed.
Exactly. And here's another angle we should discuss: innovation and progress. When trade becomes more expensive, companies may invest less in research, new technologies, and development projects. Tariffs limit access to cheaper materials, global talent, and advanced equipment. That can slow down innovation and make products more costly in the long run. For example, companies producing smartphones, electric cars, or medical equipment often rely on international cooperation. When trade barriers rise, the flow of ideas and technology slows too. So, in a sense, everyone loses, not only in money, but also in opportunities for progress.
Yes, and the most surprising part is how invisible these effects can be. People don't always notice that the higher price of a product they buy might be related to a tariff. They just see the price tag and wonder why things are getting more expensive. This makes it difficult for consumers to connect the dots between trade policy and their daily expenses. But understanding this link is important. It helps people see how decisions made in government offices can influence the cost of groceries, smartphones, or even cars. It's a lesson in how interconnected economics really is.
And this is where education becomes essential. When we understand how tariffs work and who actually pays for them, we can have more informed discussions about global trade. It's easy to say that tariffs protect jobs or punish unfair trade practices, but it's much harder to see the hidden costs behind them. In the US-China trade war, both sides believed they were standing up for fairness, but in the end, both sides' citizens carried the financial burden. It reminds us that economic conflicts often produce more harm than good, not just for governments, but for ordinary people who have no say in these decisions.
Absolutely, Adam. So who really pays the price? It's the consumer who faces higher prices, the worker who loses their job, the small business owner who struggles with costs, and the global economy that slows down because of uncertainty. In a world as interconnected as ours, trade wars don't create winners and losers. They create shared struggles. The only real solution lies in cooperation, fair negotiation, and understanding that prosperity depends on mutual benefit, not isolation. It's a lesson that every learner and every policymaker should take seriously, especially in today's complex global environment.
Beautifully said, Julia. The US-China tariff battle may have begun as an attempt to fix trade imbalances, but it revealed something far deeper, that no one truly wins in an economic confrontation of this scale. Both nations paid a price, and the rest of the world shared in the cost. For us here at the English Globe, this discussion isn't just about economics. It's about people, cooperation, and the importance of understanding global interdependence. When we see that every action in trade has a human impact, we begin to appreciate why peaceful economic collaboration is far more powerful than any tariff or trade barrier ever could be. When we study trade wars, Julia, it's not enough to look only at economics. Politics plays a huge role in shaping trade policies, and the US-China tariff battle is a perfect example. Governments rarely make decisions based purely on numbers or economic theory. Political goals, national interests, and public opinion all influence the strategies leaders choose. In the case of the United States, tariffs were presented as a way to protect American industries and workers, but they also carried a political message, showing strength, determination, and leadership on the global stage. Leaders want to be seen as defending their country's interests, and trade policy becomes a tool to communicate that vision.
Exactly, Adam. And for English learners, this is a great opportunity to understand some political vocabulary. When we say national interests, we mean the goals or priorities a country considers essential for its security, economy, or global influence. Tariffs, in this sense, were used by both the US and China to signal that their respective governments were prioritizing the economic well-being of their own people. Public perception is also critical. Governments want citizens to feel that policies are fair and effective. If leaders can show that they are standing up to a foreign competitor, It can boost national pride and strengthen political support at home.
Yes, and the concept of national pride is very important here. Leaders often present policies in a way that appeals to citizens' sense of identity and loyalty to their country. In the trade war, both the U.S. and China framed tariffs as a way to correct imbalances and defend domestic industries. The political message was clear. We are protecting our economy, our workers, and our country's future. Even if the economic outcomes are complex and sometimes costly, the symbolic message can resonate strongly with the public, showing that leaders are taking action in their nation's interest.
And that brings us to another key idea: leadership strategies. Politicians and governments often use economic measures like tariffs to achieve political goals, not just economic ones. For example, imposing tariffs can be a signal to other countries that a government is serious about negotiations or expects fair treatment in trade agreements. It can also be a way to appeal to domestic voters before an election, by showing that the government is taking decisive action to protect local jobs or industries. This is why understanding the political context is essential when we study trade policies, because economics and politics are deeply intertwined.
Exactly. And while tariffs may be framed as tools for fairness or economic balance, the public often interprets them through the lens of national identity. People may support a trade policy because it feels like their country is standing strong internationally. This is why we see leaders using media and speeches to explain tariffs in simple, emotionally appealing ways. They want to convey a clear narrative, that the country is being treated fairly, that foreign nations are held accountable, and that domestic industries are being protected. It's an important reminder that politics shapes how economic measures are perceived and accepted by the public.
Another important political term we should explain to learners is policy narrative. This is the story or explanation that leaders present to justify their decisions. In the US-China trade war, the policy narrative was that tariffs were necessary to fight unfair trade practices, stop intellectual property theft, and bring jobs back to the US. Similarly, China's narrative emphasized defending its economic sovereignty and responding proportionally to foreign measures. These narratives are carefully crafted to maintain public support, manage expectations, and project national strength.
And public opinion itself can influence political decisions in a very direct way. Governments pay attention to what citizens think because unpopular policies can be risky. In both countries, leaders had to balance the economic costs of tariffs with the political benefits of appearing tough on trade. They also needed to manage potential protests, criticism from business leaders, or concerns from consumers who saw prices rise. This delicate balance shows how trade decisions are not purely economic. They are also a reflection of political calculation and sensitivity to public sentiment.
Yes, Adam. And this is also a chance to teach learners some useful English vocabulary. Words like sovereignty, proportional response, and public sentiment are common in political discussions. Sovereignty means a nation's ability to govern itself without external interference. Proportional response refers to taking action that matches the perceived challenge or threat. And public sentiment refers to how citizens feel about a particular issue. In the trade war, all of these terms come together. Governments had to protect sovereignty, respond proportionally to tariffs, and consider public sentiment at the same time.
Another interesting aspect is how tariffs became part of broader political strategies. Both governments could use trade as leverage in negotiations on other issues, such as technology, investment, or security. By imposing tariffs, a country can strengthen its bargaining position, signaling that it is serious about achieving certain political or economic outcomes. But this approach also carries risks. If tariffs go on too long, or if they become too heavy, they can create domestic backlash or harm relationships with allies. It's a reminder that economic tools are never purely technical. They are always linked to strategic and political considerations.
That's a very important insight, Adam. And for English learners, this discussion shows how language is used in politics. Words like strategy, leverage, and bargaining position are part of the vocabulary that describes how governments interact in international affairs. Understanding these words helps learners not only follow news about trade, but also appreciate the reasoning behind decisions. In the case of the US-China tariffs, seeing these words in context helps us understand that trade policy is a mixture of economics, politics, and public communication.
Exactly. So when we look at the political dimension of the trade war, we see that tariffs were not just a tool for correcting economic imbalances. They were also instruments for demonstrating national strength, shaping public perception, and achieving political goals. Both countries presented tariffs as fair and necessary measures, even while the economic effects were complicated. And while the policies might have made headlines for their economic impact, the political framing played an equally important role in shaping public opinion and maintaining leadership credibility.
And the key lesson here is that politics and economics are always connected. Trade policies cannot be understood solely by looking at prices or exports. We must also consider national interests, leadership strategies, public sentiment, and the stories governments tell to explain their decisions. For learners of English, this is a great example of how political vocabulary, like national interests, policy narrative, sovereignty, and public sentiment, comes alive when applied to real-world events. It helps make complex topics more accessible, understandable, and engaging.
Absolutely, Julia. Understanding the political dimension helps learners see the bigger picture. The US-China tariff battle was not just a financial dispute, it was also a test of leadership, strategy, and public communication. Both governments used tariffs to signal their priorities, protect national interests, and manage public opinion. And by studying this, learners can understand that economic tools like tariffs are rarely neutral. They are deeply embedded in politics and shaped by the pressures and expectations of citizens.
Exactly. For our listeners at the English Globe, remembering this lesson is key. Economic policy is always intertwined with politics. When countries act, they consider not just profits or losses, but also leadership credibility, national pride, and public opinion. Understanding this helps us see international trade in a more complete way, as a complex dance between economic needs and political realities. And by learning the vocabulary and concepts behind these discussions, learners gain the tools to follow global news, analyze decisions critically, and participate in informed conversations about world affairs.
As we reach the conclusion of our discussion, Julia, it's clear that the US-China tariff battle teaches us far more than just economic numbers or policy decisions. It demonstrates how interconnected the modern world is, how competition and cooperation coexist in international trade, and how choices made by governments can ripple across borders to impact millions of people. For English learners, this is a perfect opportunity to understand key concepts in global economics. Terms like interdependence, global supply chains, trade policy, and economic resilience are not only technical words, but also describe real forces that influence our daily lives, from the prices we pay to the jobs available in our communities.
Exactly, Adam. One major lesson for learners is grasping the idea of global interdependence. No country exists in isolation today. The trade war shows how events in Beijing or Washington can affect businesses and workers worldwide, including in countries that supply raw materials, manufacture components, or purchase finished products. Understanding these connections helps learners follow international news, analyze global markets, and appreciate how economies rely on each other for stability and growth.
We also learned that competition and cooperation often occur at the same time. While the US and China competed for economic advantage, they also had to cooperate to maintain trade flows and global stability. Concepts like mutual benefit, economic diplomacy, and strategic negotiation are important for learners to understand, because they show that countries often need collaboration to achieve long-term prosperity, even while pursuing their own interests.
Another key point is that economic decisions have real human consequences. Tariffs are not just abstract policies. They affect consumer prices, employment, business stability, and global supply chains. Ordinary people often feel the indirect costs, like higher prices or limited access to goods. Economics is therefore not only about charts and data, but also about understanding how government policies influence everyday life locally and globally.
This podcast also emphasizes the importance of learning specialized vocabulary. Terms such as trade imbalance, tariff, innovation-driven growth, supply chain resilience, and sustainable trade might seem technical at first, but when placed in context, they become understandable and memorable. This allows learners to engage critically with news, follow economic trends, and participate in informed discussions about global affairs.
Beyond vocabulary, the tariff battle highlights critical thinking. It's tempting to label one country as the winner and the other as the loser, but the reality is more complex. Both nations face costs and benefits, and global economies respond in intricate ways. By analyzing these dynamics, learners develop skills to understand cause and effect in economics, the implications of policy choices, and the interdependence of modern international relations.
We also see that balance and cooperation are vital in global economics. Sustainable growth and economic resilience often come from working together rather than acting unilaterally. The trade war illustrated that while tariffs may provide short-term advantages, they can create long-term challenges. Policies encouraging fair competition, alongside strong international relationships, are generally more effective in sustaining global prosperity.
Looking ahead, both the US and China learned that innovation-driven growth, economic diplomacy, and strategic planning are essential to compete in the global marketplace. Investing in technology, adapting supply chains, and negotiating mutually beneficial agreements are critical for success. Learners can understand that economics is not fixed. It's dynamic, evolving, and shaped by collaboration, strategic choices, and forward-thinking policies.
The US-China tariff battle is therefore a story about economics, politics, and human impact, but it's also a lesson for the future. It teaches that global trade is about relationships, strategy, and understanding the interconnectedness of countries and peoples. For English learners, following these lessons improves language skills while also providing a framework for interpreting international events intelligently.
Finally, the key takeaway is that trade connects nations in ways that directly and indirectly influence our daily lives. Prices, job opportunities, technological progress, and political decisions are all linked through global trade networks. Understanding these connections, learning relevant vocabulary, and thinking critically about economic policies empowers learners to comprehend the modern world and engage in meaningful conversations about it.
Thank you so much for joining us on the English Globe. We hope today's discussion helped you improve your English, understand global economics, and think critically about international trade. Don't forget to like the video, subscribe to our channel, and click the notification bell so you won't miss our future episodes. Until next time, keep learning, stay curious, and remember that understanding the world around.